Imagine waking up one day with the unsettling realization that nothing in your life is technically wrong, yet something feels profoundly off. Your routines still function, your responsibilities still demand attention. You still smile when required, nod at the right moments, perform the gestures that signal you are fine. And yet, beneath the surface, there is a quiet pressure building, a weight you can't name. A tension that doesn't come from any obvious crisis, but from something far more disturbing, the sense that an entire part of you has been deliberately ignored. Not forgotten, not lost, ignored. You were taught how to be good, how to be productive, how to fit into systems, expectations, identities. You were taught how to control your impulses, soften your anger, hide your fear, reframe your sadness, and polish yourself into something acceptable. You learned early which emotions earned approval and which ones created distance, which thoughts made you lovable, and which ones made people uncomfortable. But no one ever taught you what to do with the parts of you that refuse to disappear. The resentment that lingers long after forgiveness is expected. The envy you feel toward people you're supposed to support. The quiet pleasure in imagining rebellion, destruction, or escape. The moments when you don't want to heal, you want to burn something down. So you learn to push these things into the background, to label them as weakness, immaturity, or moral failure. You told yourself they would fade with time, discipline, or positivity, and when they didn't, you worked harder to ignore them. Here is the paradox no one warned you about. The more you try to become better, the more fractured you feel inside. Why does self-improvement sometimes leave you emptier than before? Why does self-awareness often bring discomfort instead of peace? Why do people who appear the most composed often feel the most hollow? Perhaps the darkness you were never taught to face is not the enemy, but the part of you carrying a truth you've been avoiding. You live in a culture obsessed with light, growth, healing, optimization. Everything must move upward, forward, toward clarity and control. Darkness, on the other hand, is treated as a problem to eliminate, a flaw to fix, a sign that something has gone wrong. But what if darkness isn't the absence of progress? What if it's the cost of depth? Think about how early you learned this lesson. As a child, anger made adults uneasy. Fear was something to get over. Curiosity about taboo thoughts was discouraged. You were rewarded for being manageable, predictable, safe. Over time, you didn't just suppress certain emotions, you learned to suppress entire questions. Questions like, why do I sometimes feel disconnected from my own life? Why do I feel guilty for wanting more or different than what I have? Why does silence feel so loud when I stop distracting myself? And perhaps the most dangerous question of all, what part of me have I been running from? The darkness you were never taught to face doesn't announce itself dramatically. It doesn't show up as despair or rage. Often it appears as numbness, restlessness, chronic dissatisfaction, a sense that you are watching your own life from a distance, performing a role that no longer feels real. You tell yourself this is just stress, or burnout, or a phase. But deep down, you sense something else at work. Because whenever life slows down, when distractions fade, when noise quiets, when you're alone with your thoughts, that darkness starts pressing against the edges of your awareness. And instead of listening, you reach for something to drown it out. Work, entertainment, validation, improvement plans, anything that keeps you moving forward without having to look inward. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Avoiding darkness doesn't make you stronger. It makes you fragmented. You don't become whole by cutting parts of yourself away. You become functional, but incomplete. Adapted, but disconnected. Successful, but divided. And the division has consequences. A person who never faces their darkness doesn't escape it. They project it onto others, onto society, onto enemies real or imagined, onto systems they claim to hate but secretly rely on to contain what they refuse to confront within themselves. So the real question isn't whether you have darkness, it's this. What happens when an entire civilization teaches people to fear the very parts of themselves that hold their deepest power? and what happens to you, personally, when you finally stop running. Because once you see this, you can't unsee it. The discomfort you've been carrying isn't random. The tension isn't a flaw. It's a signal, a warning that something essential has been left in the shadows for too long. And in the next section, we will begin to uncover why this darkness exists, where it comes from, and how psychology, philosophy, and society conspired to convince you it should never be faced at all. The darkness you were never taught to face did not emerge by accident. It was shaped, slowly, deliberately, by forces far older and far more complex than your personal history. To understand it, you have to step back and look at how the human mind learned to survive, how societies learned to function, and how meaning itself became something we fear confronting directly. At the psychological level, the problem begins with a simple but devastating instinct: the mind's need for coherence. You crave a sense of being good, consistent, in control. Anything that threatens this internal order feels dangerous, even if it is true. So when impulses arise that contradict the image you hold of yourself, aggression, envy, cruelty, selfish desire, the mind does what it does best. It hides them, not removes them, hides them. This is where Carl Jung enters the conversation. Jung described this buried territory as the shadow, the parts of the psyche you disown because they don't align with who you believe you should be. Society encourages this process early. You're praised for compliance, restraint, and emotional cleanliness. You're subtly taught that darkness equals danger, immorality, or failure. But the shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It becomes autonomous. What you suppress doesn't weaken, it waits. Philosophically, this suppression is reinforced by the modern obsession with progress and rational control. Thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche warned that when a culture becomes addicted to comfort, order, and moral certainty, it produces individuals who fear their own depth. Nietzsche saw how people construct good identities not out of strength, but out of avoidance, avoiding chaos, ambiguity, and inner conflict. When you were taught that stability is the highest value, anything disruptive inside you feels like a threat to your survival. So you numb it, you intellectualize it, you moralize it away, and slowly your inner world becomes smaller. But the problem goes deeper. Darkness is not only psychological, it is existential. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that human beings are condemned to be free. That freedom sounds empowering until you realize what it means. There is no script, no fixed essence, no external authority that can tell you who you were supposed to be. That realization creates anxiety. Not surface-level worry, but a deep, destabilizing dread. And instead of facing that dread, most people escape into roles: employee, parent, partner, success story, victim. Roles offer structure, but they also offer hiding places. The darkness grows in Sartre's called bad faith, the quiet self-deception where you pretend you are less free, less responsible, less complex than you really are. Society reinforces this escape with remarkable efficiency. Aldous Huxley saw it clearly. Modern systems don't control people primarily through force, but through distraction and pleasure. When discomfort arises, you're offered relief, entertainment instead of reflection, stimulation instead of stillness, noise instead of confrontation. Why face your darkness when you can drown it out? The problem is that what you avoid internally doesn't dissolve, it accumulates. Unfelt emotions don't vanish, they harden. Unexamined impulses don't fade, they distort. Over time, this creates a strange inner split, the version of you that functions in the world and the version of you that carries everything you were never allowed to express. Philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer took this even further, arguing that much of human suffering comes from the refusal to accept the darker truths of existence: desire, limitation, impermanence. When you believe life should be painless, meaningful by default, and morally clean, reality itself feels like a betrayal. So you fight reality instead of understanding it. And when that fight fails, people turn inward with blame. What's wrong with me? Why can't I just be happy? Why do I feel this way when I have no reason to? Here's what no one tells you. That question itself is a symptom of the hidden problem. Even approaches meant to help, self-improvement, positivity, healing culture, often deepen the split. They promise transformation without confrontation, growth without grief, light without shadow. But real psychological integration doesn't work that way. Viktor Frankl understood that meaning is not found by eliminating suffering, but by facing it honestly. Yet modern culture reframes discomfort as pathology. Darkness becomes something to fix, medicate, optimize away. The result is a generation that knows how to cope, but not how to integrate. And integration is the key idea here. Because the darkness you were never taught to face is not random chaos. It is structured, purposeful. It contains instincts for survival, power, boundaries, and truth. When ignored, those instincts leak out sideways through resentment, addiction, projection, and self-sabotage. This is why the problem feels so personal yet so widespread. You experience it as anxiety, emptiness, or restlessness. Society experiences it as polarization, outrage, and alienation. Same root, different scale.